Okay, we're about to begin. If you can hear me, give me a thumbs up. All right. Welcome to another meeting of the Intellectual Explorers Club. I am Peter, the organizer of the group. And to give some context to those who might not be familiar, I started this club in Toronto about 2 years ago, solely as an in-person meetup. Then I created a podcast with the same name. And more recently, I was inspired to take the in-person meetings online. And I am currently dubbing these experiments Sensemaking Wormholes. And I'm inviting past podcast guests on to facilitate them. So for example, last week we had Yancey Strickler from Kickstarter fame. Today we have Jordan Hall. And in the pipeline, we have the likes of John Vervaeke, Andrew Taggart, and Guy Sensak confirmed. So I'm pretty much allowing the facilitator to do whatever he or she wants. Last week, for example, Yancey did more of a workshop with like a PowerPoint and group exercises. But today we're going to lean more on sourcing the collective intelligence of the group. So in a moment, I'll hand it over to Jordan and he'll speak more on that. But first, I'll speak a little bit about it myself. Let's see. So I think Jordan has, it's needless to say, he has a great mind and is incredibly intelligent. And because of this, I think it's understandable to look up to him as an epistemic authority on Game B. And as he mentioned to me previously, he mostly shows up, at least on the internet, in sort of a broadcasting mode. So I imagine, if we hold on too tightly to this frame of Jordan being the epistemic authority of Game B, it might turn this session to some kind of Q&A dynamics. But I want to make it clear that this particular sense-making session is not about that. So that being said, I'll hand it over to the man who needs no introduction, Jordan Hall.
Apparently, I've finally gotten to the point that I've always been going after, which is I don't have to worry about people asking me how to introduce myself. That's nice. So I think maybe a way to start this is to just have a very simple round. Everybody just introduces themselves. And where I think, although I would definitely urge a high degree of agency in terms of choosing what seems to be the right answer. But I think that a good approach would be to actually focus on how it is that you chose to be in this particular context, to be on this call today. What aspect of you is what's actually showing up here? And then if there's any particular question or curiosity or inquiry in or about the domain of Game B that is alive, then bring that into the center as well. And then hopefully what we can actually do is we can try to find a way to have a coherent conversation, which is to say that we'll each be listening very closely to what in fact actually wants to be said in the group, which requires a real effective application of Rule Omega, which means notice when you're, I suppose saying the language of ego might be strong, when your ego is speaking, or when there's a strong sense of performative or controlling speaking coming out of you. And notice if you can listen to what other people are saying in such a way that you can hear the thing that is trying to be spoken, not necessarily what's being said, but the deeper basis of what's endeavoring to be expressed. And then if it is yours, and it may very well not be, there's a lot of people on this call, to further that, then try to find the best way in yourself to further that. And so in some sense, ideally, we will find ourselves noticing that there is a single tone, a single thing that is being expressed here. And if not, perhaps we'll learn a little bit. So I'm not sure does everybody have the same geometry I have, or is it just should I call everybody's name?
One way to do it, Jordan, is to just choose someone, and then the person goes, and then that person chooses someone else to go. Nice. So it's like play tag. And so if everyone just zooms out so they can see like everyone on their screen, that would be great.
So I will choose 16478699182, which is I assume a character from Blade Runner. It's on my bottom right corner.
Hi, this is Daniel. I apologize if there's ambient noise, but I just called in because I'm 5 minutes away from a computer. And I'm lacking a little bit of context, so I don't know if I'm the best first person to go, but I can try.
If you'd like, we can take you off the hook and punt it to my second favorite.
All right, that's probably the best call.
Nice. All right, so we were already beginning. So we'll now go with the entity named Jordan, who is not me.
Sorry, I haven't been able to figure out how to change my name mid-call to make that easier. So you're saying, what is the thing that's bringing me to this call right now the most? So my interest in Game B right now is, I feel like in the way that you've described it, I'm sitting in a stage where I'm really trying to develop my individual sovereignty right now, more than anything else. And I am interested in, I don't know, I guess I'm interested in that, and I have like a number of pieces of curiosity around what to do when you're sort of sitting at that stage where you don't feel like you're really ready to become a big driver in the more broad sense. I think that's it. Was there something else you wanted me to add, or?
If there was a particular question about the nature or essence of Game B that felt meaningfully alive, and then pick the next person in the chain.
Okay.
By the way, if you're near the tail end, you have to remember everybody who's already gone. It's actually a bit of a burden.
Okay, so I guess my curiosity is around that, and it's like, so okay, so if you feel like you're not in that part of like strong enough individual sovereignty to start entering into the higher stages, what do you do? And then what is like a broader functioning Game B system? How does a broader functioning Game B system address people who are in that stage and see them? And like, to what degree do you involve yourself in the higher levels? That's sort of what I'm thinking. And I guess I'll just pick Amy W.
Sorry, that got a little crossways. So I'm Amy. I feel like I fell down a rabbit hole and came here. Honestly, one thing led to another of watching YouTube videos. I'm an art critic in New York City and an educator. And this just became something I became really fascinated with. It became something that completely dovetailed with how I've been thinking about myself in connection with society. I'm a big theory and philosophy person, which kind of, I was always satisfied just being an art critic and using that there, but in the recent years, I've felt really called to this wider kind of systems thinking. This just wasn't anything I was interested in before. Now I'm really fascinated by it. So yeah, everything I just devoured when I started listening to Jordan Hall's work, Daniel Schmachtenberger. Everything resonated so clearly with me that I just wanted to go deeper and deeper. So I've just fallen deeper into this rabbit hole. And because I'm an art person and aesthetics person, I guess I'm wondering what the aesthetics and art of Game B will be. And I will pick, next to go, I will pick Brent.
Hi, I'm a researcher in metamodernism, so that dovetails with this. And I'm also a critic of the intellectual dark web, which has some background and kind of legacy artifacts with this topic. And I'm a fan of Peter Lindbergh and his work and his activity, and some of the neurohacker guys like Zach Stein and Daniel Schmachtenberger, and to some extent Mr. Hall here, the Honorable. Yeah, so I hope to learn and also contribute something. I'll pick Phil because he's next to me.
Man, what drew me to Game B? Couple of things. One was really making sure that humanity survives as long as possible, and that civilization doesn't collapse. And second one was around what Daniel Schmachtenberger says around emergence and synergy. I think it mapped onto a book I read really early on called Non-Zero, about non-zero sums. My question that I've been thinking about for a couple of days now is how to create a religion without religion. Specifically, how do we create something with unity, but without the coercion or being told how to think or what to do. And I am going to pick Isaiah.
Hello, it's Isaiah actually with an S, but it's okay. So yeah, I kind of got into this space by following the Twitter hashtag down to the very end, and it really resonated with a lot of the previous stuff I'd studied, and it really resonates with my current interest in. As someone who lives in Canada, I'm learning a lot more about the cultures and philosophy of the Indigenous people who are here, and it seems to me almost like they had developed like a proto game B, and so I think there might be something we can learn from that to help develop the actual game B. Yeah, so I will pass it to Jake.
Thank you, Isaiah. So I'm Jake. I'm a filmmaker. I also do media for an academic institute focused on psychology and technology stuff. And in terms of what brings me to this conversation, I had for a long time a kind of diffuse set of interests in politics and narrative and epistemology and meditation and existential risk, and all these things were just sort of disparate communities that I was involved in that really didn't have any dialogue with one another. And I certainly didn't know how to unify them in my own mind. But I had a strong intuition that there was some kind of relevance of each of these areas of inquiry to the others. And when I started stumbling upon this kind of larger conversation around sense making, it did at least give me a framework, not just for unifying my own interests, but for sort of seeing why each of those had seemed so kind of vital and important to me. So yeah, that's kind of how I got involved in this, got interested in this. And then the question that's kind of most alive for me with respect to Game B is, unlike a lot of other kind of political conversations, it seems to place equal emphasis on kind of this individual sovereignty component and self-development and also this kind of larger systemic or incentive design approach. And one of the things I'm most interested in learning about is kind of how those two relate to one another. What's the proper domain for each? So that's what I'm thinking about. And I will pass to Zachary.
Hey there. Quite a lot of people from Toronto or Ontario, so it seems it's good. I suppose I'm always up for a good conversation. And I came to Game B kind of chasing that perpetual pursuit of self-development, which includes understanding what we would call Game A, which is how I kind of came on to everything that led me to Game B a couple years ago. I've wanted to get into the Intellectual Explorers Club, but up until I think last week, I haven't been able to get down there in person. And what interests me about Game B is that through the rapid acceleration in exchanges, I guess, mediated through the internet and all this new technology, is that it seems like we're poised for a big breakthrough in something new. So I'm curious to see how things are developing And what better way than to get out and speak with everybody. Interested to see how things will turn out. And I suppose I'll pass it over to Antoine.
What brought me, so a few years ago, I became interested in what Jordan has termed sovereignty, just increasing, I guess, your own agency. And that led me to find Neurohacker or find Neurohacker's website, and then Jordan's some of Jordan's work, and what brought me to this individual discussion is I've found that following the interest that I've developed in the last few years, all the way to the actual closest I can get to physical interactions, seems to be really productive, seems to increase my sovereignty, I would say. So I'm not sure that I have a meaningful question on Game B for everyone right now. I would send it to Jubilee.
Right, I don't really know exactly. People hear me? My picture didn't pop up on the screen. That usually means that, yeah. Thanks, Jordan. So learned not. I am here to participate in Game B with other people. This is what I've been doing full time for the last 3 years, is figuring out how to create an omni-win, what I was calling a world that works for everybody. And although I feel like I've created it in my own head, that's not where it needs to exist. It needs to exist in the real world. And in order to do that, we have to create it together. And that's what I am here for, is to hear other people's ideas and participate in that conversation. And the question I have that is burning for me is, in respect to Game B, what is a litmus test or a checklist, something of like, this is what is Game B, this is what something would be like under Game B versus not under Game B. So when anyone, regardless of prestige, brings something to the table, how do we know whether in its essence it is Game B or by default Game A? And let me see who has been called on. I don't see Chad on my list, so I'm going to call Chad.
Chad, I'm not too far from Toronto. I'm in Ann Arbor, Michigan. What brings me here is, it's hard to say. Actually, I'm a recovering or an ex-academic. I have a background in Earth system science, Earth governance, a field called science technology studies. And for some reason, I never say for done 2 postdocs and still was never able to find my niche. In the meantime, I've been, over the years, following different threads that are convergent, and some of them have been mentioned already, like Non-Zero, Robert Wright's book. Brent, we were on another one of these calls, and I guess you're from Perspectiva. Been following Perspectiva independently. Alternative currencies, Holochain. And I never, for a long time, never saw these put together, and now more and more they are being put together. So there was some sort of stream underlying my inquiry that I didn't know about that is revealing itself. So I feel like part of this is me following the stream, because I've long since given up really being able to fully given up the attempt to fully steer where I'm going. So it's process discovery, and it's exciting too. So for me, the question is, well, where, again, how to live it, and how to be critical of it without falling prey to the tendency of critique to push things away without reflecting back on itself in a constructive way, which is one of the things that compelled me to leave academia. So excited to talk to you guys here. I guess a couple people are still remaining. How about Mike? Have you gone?
Hey everyone, I'm Mike. I decided to show up today because I speak with Peter at least a couple times a month in other settings, and I've been tracking the sort of lines of thinking that Jordan has been elucidating for some time. And I found this, I find myself having a lot of experience listening to the conversations and a lot of experience thinking about this stuff, to have an experiment to be amidst mostly strangers and to see what arises where there is at least some degree of shared understanding. I found myself very curious to see what was here for me. And the question that feels alive in me right now is, how can I learn to more deeply listen, and how can I use this venue that we have here to further capacity? So I'm interestingly having, I'm not seeing names show up associated with everyone on the screen, but I believe I recognize Tim from Facebook, and you haven't gone. So there we go.
Hi, I'm Tim. I'm here after a few years, multiple years of following what seemed meaningful, and particularly those things that were meaningful in such a way that I could participate in. And I've had interesting conversations with Peter and Jordan before, and I'm taking some sort of steps towards bringing people together in person to do something that shares enough in common with this, that I realize a real interest and need to learn as much as possible from doing it as much as possible with people who are able to do it really well, so that I can better do it, and more broadly to act appropriately in relationship to all of that. As for a question, I'm interested in the degree to which one has to be successful at game A in order to play game B. And I think the last person is Jorge, perhaps.
Can't hear you, Jorge.
Hello? All right. So I arrived a little late for the conversation as I tried to settle into where I was coming in. So can you remind me of the questions? What were the questions again?
Yeah, the two questions were very simple. One was, what aspect of yourself brought you here? And what is it that chose to make you be the showing up here? And the second is, to the degree to which there's a question that has any real aliveness for you in the context of Game B, what is that?
Sure. So a couple months ago, I decided to leave my career because of some differences in direction for the organization, and I was really satisfied with my work, but the one thing, and I was happy every day that I was there, but I was upset with the monetary value that I was receiving. I didn't think I was being compensated enough, and there were some decisions to hire people that I would be leading and part of my team that were coming in from different angles, and it just wasn't making any sense in there. And I thought I could continue to do the work, but I didn't want to. It's hard to feel a disconnect with how the job.
Or hey, I think your headphones.
Can you not hear me anymore?
Yeah, there we go.
I'm hearing myself because I called in. So there was a disconnect for me with what I was doing and how I was getting paid for it. And I decided that I wanted to find my own ways to get income from it while still being part of the organizations. And that didn't turn out so well. And then I came across an article that Reese shared on Twitter, and I talked about some reforms in education for the future and how we can really promote sustainability for the planet and everybody, and just new ways of doing things. And through that, I started to come across Game B, and I am a little up in the air as to what it means. Is it sustainable? Is it a way of living that I can do right now? And so in my mind, the last couple of days, is this Coney all over again? Is this, or is this more like Make, where it had such an influence that it really did shape or grow some microcultures and help empower a lot of people? And so I have a lot of questions as to what this is.
Three of us haven't gone, Daniel, Melissa, and myself. So I'll go. What brought me here is the Daemon. Sort of all my activities really, that's outside of how I source my livelihood, I would say is Daemon inspired. And for those of you who are not familiar with that term, it's more of it's a certain quality of intuition that says, go here. And the question I have is, this is just came to me when I was speaking with Jordan and Phil before this call, is what's the role of sacrifice in playing Game B? And I'll choose my stoic partner in crime, Daniel.
Hey, my name is Daniel. I think there are many things that brought me here today, but the most proximal cause is that I've noticed as I learn more about existential risk, I start to feel this low-level hum of anxiety just operating in the background at all times. And as I become more aware of that sensation, I realize that it's not particularly useful on its own, but it doesn't seem like it's appropriate to completely dismiss it either. So I wanted to find some way to act on that feeling that seemed potentially productive. And this seemed to be a step in the right direction, because I don't really know what to do with that feeling. But doing nothing doesn't seem like a good option. My question, actually, Tim kind of stole my question. More broadly, I want to know a little bit more about how I can start practicing Game B in a very practical, mundane, like day-to-day sense, such that it's actually rippling out positively across time for issues of existential risk. But one of the main qualifiers is, to what extent does one need to be successful at Game A in order to play Game B successfully? And I guess I will choose Melissa, who's probably the last one.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. I apologize for being late. Didn't know where to find the Zoom link. So I'm disappointed that I didn't get to hear all of your answers to these questions. But what part of me brings me to this conversation is all of me, because I've been dying to have this conversation. I keep sending videos and podcasts to everybody and all my people, and can't seem to get anyone to engage with me in this way. So this is a real gift, and I appreciate all of you for that. The questions I have are, what do we do? What do we all do together? And where to begin? I mean, it's already begun, but next steps, how to connect, actual projects, deepen the practices of being sovereign. And I want to get myself around more people and having these conversations in order to actually start taking some action. So I'm curious about my next steps is how to do that.
Peter, do you have anything left, or is it ball in my court?
Yep, it's all you.
Great. So I'm Jordan, and I am here because the thing that has begun the process of happening, at least to some extent with my participation over the past 7 years, seems to be having more energy. And there's something about that, to use Peter's language, that it seems to be deeply resonant with my daemon. So the inquiry that brings you all here is an inquiry that brings me here as well. So a few things that were coming up for me that I noticed as I was listening was some part of me definitely wanted to just begin the process of answering each of these questions. And of course, I noticed a couple of things. One was, that's really not going to be reasonable in the context of a group of this size, and the number of questions that we have. The next thing was that it's probably not even reasonable in general. It's probably not the right approach to take to try to address the questions that are actually being asked. So then I had an interesting memory of being in a conversation somewhat like this, and noticed that I was asked to take a perspective to kind of observe what was happening, and notice what was happening inside myself, and try to sense all the different things that were coming up in me and all the different ways they were coming up. Notice what observations happened to be impressing themselves upon me in terms of the group and what was happening there. And then more broadly, try to sense or notice if there was something that somehow seemed to kind of like be waving at me from the far distances, from the periphery, or from the horizons. And in that context, one of the things that was quite interesting to me is that I noticed that even as the conversation seemed to have a life of its own, looking back, each person's question actually seemed to have a piece of it brought forward. Which is to say that if each person reflected on their own inquiry, they would actually notice that something in the conversation was actually meaningfully extending their own inquiry, even if it wasn't explicitly done so. And also that people's depth of inquiry, their questions got richer and deeper. So perhaps that's the thing that is alive for me today, is how might that work? And so I would just repeat the question that was with the title. What does it mean for us to play a game B? What is this notion of meaningfulness, and how does that notion of meaningfulness guide us moment to moment in a context like this one? So as things come up, if you feel like something is really calling for you to bring it in, please do so. Notice what's happening in yourself and in others, and let's see what happens.
Forgive me, are we, is this the point where we're allowed to chime in? I'm sorry, I can't hear you. Is it muted?
Yeah, please do. Yes, you're quite permitted
Okay,
to chime in.
So the thing that came up for me when you were speaking was that when I was giving my initial answer, I was describing a kind of collection of interests that I had that seemed to find expression in some kind of larger communal project. The interest that had seemed disparate and kind of unique to me had expression in a larger project. And I'm wondering if that general phenomenon of an individual's kind of strange concatenation of interests finding expression in collective projects might be part of what it means to play Game B, or what might be something that Game B enables to a greater degree.
I will speak to that and just say that I hope so, because it really doesn't make this trajectory really doesn't make any sense for my life otherwise, because I don't have any kind of, I don't know, like I said in my kind of opening statement, the path that brought me here is it has nothing to do with my life in New York and being an art critic in the general sense of what that means professionally, but personally it makes sense to me because I have engaged in so much self-work, and because that kind of for me generates, once you kind of do that for a while, it kind of becomes obvious that what you're doing yourself needs to kind of you need, I don't know how to this sounds sort of, it needs to be beyond just yourself, I guess, and that didn't seem initially like that was ever going to be something that would make me be interested in the theories and ideas of people from a completely different sector of the world and that sort of thing. But I mean, I have to believe that something, I would think that that would be kind of what you're saying, Jake, rings true to me in the sense that, like, we do seem like quite different people on the surface, but there's something that kind of tethers us all together, and that would seem like what I would think of as a Game B-ish type quality.
One thing that's coming up for me, hearing people speak, and it's resonating with my question about how to do this together, is that there's the social aspect. So by calling it Game B, we're already identifying a sociality to it. There are other ways of dealing with existential risk or despair. So one thing here is we're noting it's social. We're also noting it's a game, and that it's not the first in a series of games, but there is at least one prior to it. So bringing those things together, I wonder if that might also speak to the question of what does it take, or does one need to succeed in Game A in order to play Game B? So part of it might be the game of transmuting Game A into Game B.
Not sure that you can, like, I think to the extent that you can succeed at Game A, it seems like you can't play Game B. Game A is built on a sort of disinterest in, I guess, what seems to me by definition the qualities the Game B is trying to foster. Yeah.
I noticed the question popping up in me, which would be something like, what does it mean to succeed in game A? And also noticing that perhaps there's a juxtaposition between the question, what does it mean to succeed in game A, and what does it mean to play game B?
I love that question, Jordan, because it stirred something in me. Because I'm not successful at game A. Game A success equals money and power. And whether that's true or that's just my story, I will do further inquiry on later. But that what Antoine was saying, that success in game B is almost antithetical to, maybe I'm putting words in his mouth, to success in game A. I know what puts me in a place to know how to play game B is exactly what game A does not reflect on. It's my disability, it's my poverty, it's the stuff that puts me at a disadvantage in game A. It gave me all of the capacity and the space to create what I believe is a solution for game B, which I'm still sitting with and dealing with how to do it in a group, how to communicate it, how to do any of that. But that even in this game B space, there's a lot of somewhat needing to already be successful, right? Needing to have an education, needing to be articulate, needing to have certain things that other people, I luckily do have access to that, but don't necessarily have access that other people have access to. And so that's just what was coming up for me. And like I said, I will sit with that further. What does success mean for game A?
It seems like we are comprised of many components in the psyche. And if that's the case, can some of us be ready, as in some parts of us, be ready to play game A, while some other parts are ready to play game B? What does that leave us with?
I agree with the challenges of playing game A, where like you need to come in with the financial means to sustain, to be able to think in game B. And I think a lot about working collaboratively as a means to enable that. So like here in this city, at least in Chicago, there are spaces where groups have pulled together to buy buildings to foster their creative arts or foster their use of science equipment or manufacturing equipment. But then they still need to continue having a place to stay in. And that seems to be the biggest challenge. Everyone needs a safe place to go. Everyone values privacy, and privacy is such a weird topic for me as well. There's some things that are so locked down, like medical records, in fear of what insurance companies might do. We could all benefit if we opened up that information. Then there's the other end where people want their individual privacy. That's why we see phones, to raise our family or to hide ourselves from everybody else.
Hopefully this is coherent. I feel called to say that I had a discussion with a friend who was just trying to also become a game B player. And he told me that he had to release being a game A player, and a lot of the things that he was learning in game B could be applied to do really well in game A. And I guess just to pull on that a little bit, for me, it feels like just in general, we're all maybe trying to increase our impact or our value that we're creating for the world. It just happens that in game A, people are sucking that in terms of for power or for money, versus for game B, it's more about letting it be not needing to be captured, but it's to be actually given to the whole. So in that sense, like, I think each and one of us are in a kind of game A environment right now. And while playing game B, people can see us as kind of more beacons of light, where like there's something interesting about each and one of us because we're here. And as we develop our own sovereignty and get in the right relationships, we're able to actually, I guess, generate more, I'd say, like value for those around us, even though we may not be particularly capturing it, and sort of be elevated even in the game A space.
I really like that. A couple things came to me, the term emotional vampire, and then this feminist motto, personal is political. And if to repurpose that, the relational is political. And like I teach interpersonal skills, that's what I do for a livelihood. And I've been like researching all these kinds of different conversational modalities. And if you kind of put it on a spectrum, like I, it, and then the I, thou, to use blueprint terms, it's like pickup artists and stuff like that. It's like, that's the I, it, that's the quintessential I, it. And then these new kind of technologies that are popping up, like circling or we spaces, they're like I, thou tech. And I wonder how much, if you practice those, how much that's going to bleed over in your everyday life. And the story that comes to mind, and I tell this frequently in some of the courses I teach, is when I got married this time last year in Ireland. And, you know, I got elopement in Ireland with my wife. So I didn't think I was going to be nervous at all. And then the day of, I was like super nervous. And then I was like, oh man, what's going on? And then the priest came and he just looked at me and he's like, no bother, Peter, no bother, no worries. And then immediately, like, boom, I just dropped. Because I could tell instantly he was like a man of God. He was like overflowing with presence. And he sort of liberated me from my anxiety at that moment or whatever I was going through. So to Phil's point, I wonder if we show up in this way, how much we could just not only liberate ourselves, but liberate others.
I'm sensing some connection. Hearing what Tim shared about the sense of, you know, the simultaneous playing both game A, game B, and it's not a discrete shift where I'm suddenly a game B player solely. There's this sort of slow transformation, or at least pieces of me to begin to lean into, and that connects with me. I believe it was what Chad shared about how do we transmute game A to game B. It has something to do with that, it feels like. And the niche, the place that we are feels so, the world as we conceive of it and all the rules and everything that is so deeply controlled or conditioned by culture. And we have some say in creating new artifacts of culture, or at least experimenting with new ways of being. And so when I connect that with what Tim's sharing, my sense is, how can I try these things on? And essentially, the more that we can lean into this game B space, the more playing field we create for others, so that it perhaps becomes more accessible. And so that's sort of what I'm connecting.
A couple things came up for me when you were sharing that, Mike. One of them, surprisingly, is the term McMindfulness, which for those of you who haven't heard before, it's kind of a critique on how, I guess, like modern Western society has adopted meditation practices. And the way I understand it, or the piece of it that has been useful for me, is the realization that when people learn about the utility of meditation, they think in terms of utility, and they schedule like 30 minutes a day, you know, if they're good, to meditate, maybe in the mornings before they go to work or something like that. And that's just kind of the way we tend to fit things. You know, we have slots, and then we add something to that slot, and that is there's a whole set of assumptions that make life like that. And maybe it comes from having a 9 to 5 or having kind of a discrete boundary between weekdays and weekends. And a related idea is this feeling that I've had where I can still remember what it was like to not actually know that a weekend was a different thing from a weekday, and that sense of expansiveness that I felt as a child, where it was just life and there were no discrete boundaries between things. So to connect that with the rest of the discussion, it makes me, my first thought when hearing what everybody was saying was maybe one way to play game B while we're still in game A is to negotiate these small slots that, you know, it's like some sort of liminal sacred space that you come in and you play game B in that space, and you get to practice it, and you get to build your game B muscles, so to speak. And then maybe at some point it'll start bleeding into the rest of your life. But then the counterpoint came up, which was this McMindfulness thing, which is maybe that's fundamentally the wrong model. And maybe to think of it as something to just fit in to the existing way that we do things is just flawed completely. And what we really need is to kind of completely reevaluate how we even think about our time, how we think about time itself.
Daniel, that reminds me of a very wise woman who I spent some time with, who just asked the question, what would happen if we treated every moment as if it mattered?
So something's come up for me as this discussion's going on, especially with relation to the McMindfulness comment, as well as what Peter was talking about with the priest. And I'll see, hopefully I can articulate this well, but it reminds me of something that a friend of mine very recently said to me when I was sort of talking about my worries about trying to get like my own life sorted out and everything. And he said, well, you know, why don't you, if you feel like you're spinning your wheels, why don't you just go and help people? Because if you're stuck with, you know, you're not able to figure out how to fix certain situations in your life, and you've got a bunch of time, then just spend it on other people. And it kind of messed me up in the head, because it never occurred to me why that wasn't just so obvious to me to begin with. And then I thought more about it, and in relation with Peter's comment about his, like, the very like godly man who is the priest, I think people really, really vastly underestimate the sort of spiritual and material power and charisma associated with people who are truly selflessly motivated in what they do. And there's a bit of a game A error, which is that people overestimate their abilities to sort of calculate how everything will turn out for them out into the future, and underestimate how the world will sort of form itself around helping you to succeed as you put more and more positive effort out into the world and succeed at doing that.
There's a kind of thread that I feel like I'm noticing in a few of the last comments, starting with when Peter mentioned this phrase of the personal is political, and I have this kind of like aversive initial reaction to that phrase, but in the way that it turned out that Peter was describing it as the relational is political, it wasn't the version of it that I have the aversion to, which is to say, it's not that the relational has to be turned into a kind of power dynamic, but precisely the opposite, that it no longer needs to carry on that, or to take on that kind of zero-sum power quality, but rather can be something else. And there's a similar thing that I noticed in the McMindfulness comment and in the comment that Jordan that both Jordans made, which is that one faulty aspect of game A is that it doesn't have any language for a non-utility maximizing way of being, which is to say things that we might want to practice for their own sake rather than things that we might want to get. And relationships get kind of subsumed in that acquisitive frame of mind, and as to do kind of economic activities, and even something that's by definition a practice like mindfulness gets subsumed in this kind of acquisitive frame of mind. So that's what came up for me.
I've noticed a connection between some thoughts here. It seems that, so one thing that I would say is a game A quality is it seems like someone's playing they're not really playing a game, they're pretending to play a game. They are, I don't know, I think that's the best I could put it. And so I think that there's some game B is rooted in a sort of pursuit for authenticity. And I think it's authenticity both in yourself and what's actually happening between people. And I would say that for Tim's comment, maybe part of you isn't, if, you know, what do you do if part of you is still interested in playing game A and another part of you interested in playing game B? Maybe you could funnel that desire into simulating ways that can help you play game B, ways that can help you eventually become more authentic, which I think would also be more unified as a person. And Julie's comment, how I think that you can somewhat inherit the benefits of a different game without necessarily playing it yourself. You can funnel these benefits into different, possibly more authentic or productive ways of existing. I feel like that.
I think one facet of the interstitial point between gay and A and game B might just be in having the ability to, when you're in those authentic moments, identify them. So you can kind of identify a game A situation versus a game B situation, and maybe think about how this game A situation could have turned into a game B situation, how it could have been, I don't want to say optimized because that seems very game A, but how social interactions that take on the flavor of game A, which I would say like would be maybe like somebody being a bulldozer and another person being a doormat or something of that nature could, you know, what's the way that that interaction could have gone in a more anti-rivalrous, non-zero-sum kind of way. Because I do think that for me, this feels like something that happens between people and that blossoms out to a wider way of being.
One phrase I heard recently that reminded me of is just noticing when meaning is being crowded out of a situation. And that's a good initial criterion for saying, you know, something's gone wrong here.
And this question of meaning, I think, is pretty critical too. Another word, meaningfulness, has come up. And there, I think there's an important, I mean, there's a distinction there. I know there are technical, like philosophical distinctions, but when I hear it, there's something, the difference to me is meaning is something that is more well-defined, it's more goal-oriented, where meaningfulness is fluid, and it's, maybe somebody can help with the teasing this out, but there's a connection there with presence and authenticity that makes it pay attention to some things differently than if we're focused on meaning. And Amy, I think you said you work in aesthetics. I think there's a hint there towards aesthetics too, and the difference between something that's rife with or bereft of meaning versus meaningfulness, and how the aesthetic question really is directing us to think or live towards meaningfulness?
This same question came up at yesterday's meeting in Toronto on the meaning crisis, where Phil and Jordan, the other Jordan, were there. And it's like the idea of meaning, or what's the meaning of life, is sort of almost a disembodied propositional question that has like a yes or no answer to it, where meaningfulness is like you're full of meaning. You know, it's like it grabs you. It's a felt sense state of being.
Can I pull on a few threads here? So the question, what does it mean to play Game B? I think we can ask it at every level, like within ourselves. What does it mean to be non-rivalrous within ourselves, as in the different parts that want to play different games? And how do we make those parts non-rivalrous? And there's also a thread about, you know, there are finite games within infinite games. So we can just note that and kind of set that aside for a second. But how do we play Game B in our intimate relationships with our families? How do we play Game B at work? How do we play Game B in broader social situations? How do we extend it out and be non-rivalrous? And we're still swimming in Game A, but I think we can find ways to make choices that bring that way of being into all of these different considerations. There was also, and I think in the way that I've been thinking about it is that it's is integration. That there's a way that where humanity sits right now is like we have like the process of development being a process of differentiation and integration, that we have differentiated ourselves from our environment, and now we are in the process, hopefully, of reintegrating it as a new identity and identifying not with our environment, but maybe like with the cosmos or with something bigger, with awareness, who knows. But so there's some thoughts.
And I think there's something telling there also about meaning and meaningfulness in a pluralistic society. So if the health of the collective hinges on the question of meaning, well, that's an unlikely proposition that everyone's going to agree to. By contrast, if we organize or we, again, not optimize, but towards a plurality of meaningfulness, that seems more possible. And that could be both done in a rivalrous or a non-rivalrous and constructive way. So what would collective pluralistic meaningfulness look like?
I feel compelled to say that those last two comments remind me a lot of one of the most overused, loaded terms in the English language, which is love. Specifically, that concept that Melissa articulated about being anti-rivalrous across multiple levels and within yourself, being one of those levels. That kind of reminds me of self-love or self-parenting, where, you know, there's part of you that wants, you know, path A, and there's part of you that wants path B, and maybe B is the better path, and your higher self, so to speak, knows that, and so you can kind of force that upon yourself in a non-loving manner, and then you'll see how far that gets to. Or you can approach the whole situation with, maybe compassion's a better word, and that allows for that integration process to happen more naturally. And I think then that also leads into relationships. And I think this goes all the way back to Peter's question initially, which is, what is the role of sacrifice in playing Game B? And I'll leave with this one comment. I think my definition of love is not fully fleshed out, but I know that it involves an element of sacrifice. And maybe to make that more tangible, when you're having, say, conflict with a loved one, the best chance you have at achieving resolution across time is to have buffer for one another, buffer for your partner, you know, being an asshole from time to time, so that they have buffer for you to do that as well, and then doing that within yourself, and then doing that across society.
I think that notion of, oh, go ahead, excuse me.
I think the notion of buffering is really interesting. I'd be interested in how we could take that on with respect to, this is a hard thing to say, something to do with the nature of time. Because if game B is a city on a hill, maybe. I don't think it quite is. I think, in fact, it is a process ever unfolding. But if we take it as a city on a hill just for a moment, there's some path between here and there. So there's some sort of transition. And that's what I mean with this parts of us here and there. We're embedded in the world. And from one context, we may be able to be more in the mode of game B, more able to be loving. And in others, we might walk out and all of a sudden, maybe some baseline fundamental bit of security isn't there. And it's, if you don't have something in you that is well developed enough to protect yourself from a specific game A threat, perhaps, then what in your structure is compromised, that might be necessary in order to be a vehicle to continue moving towards the city on the hill that is game B. So this notion of buffering and time, and something else that I think is really important is a practice, being able, and authenticity is part of it, this meaningfulness is part of it, is what kind of way can we drop in? It's the cultivation of a practice that enables you to drop into something that is somehow beneath, between, and above all of that. It's transcendent to all of that, but is nevertheless participatory, which is the recentering thing, which enables somehow this orientation, despite the fact that there is the city on the hill that you have to be moving towards, but not yet there. And that seems like a broader point regarding life. But the notion of buffering and time is interesting as a sense of forgiveness there with respect to how much you are or are not able to continue moving. Really feeling into some notion of buffering and the period of time we're considering this process to be unfolding. And I'll just leave it with the question, what if a successful game B, even that's not the right way to say the question, but what if we were talking about something that's 200 years into the future? What are we really playing then, right? If a game B that is more fully present in the lives of some critical number of people, such that it is the game that is being played more, if that's centuries into the future, what really are we doing now?
Feel called to say something. I'm going to try to incorporate Tim's question into that. I've noticed the use of quasi-religious language in this conversation, and I don't think that's a bad thing. I kind of want to also address Phil's original question about how do you create a religion that's not like religion. And so for me, when I come to these spaces, to the I thou spaces, I feel like I'm bringing a very sacred idea with me. And so for me, to put it, I guess, in a straightforward way, it's to try to find the balance between science and religion. And I want to engage with people while honoring that idea with me. And so maybe how to play game B is, to borrow a term from Jesus, is to go make disciples of other people. And so to try to create spaces where other people can have like a sacred idea and try to have conversations similar to what we're doing here. So maybe I'll ask the question if maybe anyone else in the group feels like they bring like a sacred idea with them to these types of spaces.
For me, it's the idea of stewardship, and I think going along with some of Tim's point as to what we are doing now and looking into the future, it's there's a gentleman, I think his name is Nathan on Twitter, who commented about this event and mentioned that we're not necessarily playing Game B, more so we're constructing the framework for it, for building a better future. And so we're having the discussions now. We're coming together to build on these ideas, because we can't really just do it on our own, and we need to hear from one another to prepare ourselves and beyond ourselves.
I have something to say about the sacred idea. It strikes me that sovereignty, as you all describe it, is awakening. Like the ultimate of sovereignty is awakening, and it is building the capacity that I think it was Tim is speaking of having the capacity to not be pulled off center. And the ultimate of that is, I mean, this is my own personal philosophy, but as of not identifying solely with the self, and the degree to which we are this body, or we are this mind, or we are our goals, or we are that's the degree to which we have so much to protect, and so much to keep safe, you know. I think Daniel Schmachtenberger talks about that we don't meaningfully exist without all this other stuff. And so to take that identity, that sense of self, and kind of disperse it to the rest of the world and however far you want to go is a way to A, feel safer, and B, be able to stay on center and have what you intend to happen and what you mean to be.
To build off that thread of kind of loosening attachment to ego and what role that kind of plays in Game B, I feel like there's a thread in a few of the different topics we've been discussing of but both love and meaning have this component of being relational, and they're not solely in the self, nor are they like kind of solely in the world. They're processes, and a lot of real relationship, or the kind of conversation that we're having now, entails opening yourself up to being affected by whomever you're relating with. So if I'm relating to this group or anyone just as a isolated self, I'm not really opening myself up to being transformed by that process of relating. And I think meaning has that component as well, where meaning is not a thing that you're going to find kind of as Peter said, as like a proposition that's out in the world, nor is it something that you can have as a kind of isolated ego self. It emerges in the process of interaction with others, with the world. And I think that shift from kind of isolated selves and a world without subjectivity to some conception of this ongoing process that is the relationship between people and between people in the world. There's something there for Game B.
I feel compelled to just drop in the concept of sacrifice again into everything that you just described, Jake.
Yeah, you're mentioning sacrifice in the context of love made me think, you know, the sacrifice that love entails is opening yourself to the other.
So
I think of the.
Oh, do you want to go, George?
I just very shortly. I hear sacrifice, but I feel altruism as a better term, almost. Not to say that you are necessarily harming yourself. Sometimes it is not to your benefit, but I feel like altruism might be a better fit for that idea.
I kind of feel an affinity for sacrifice because it involves a certain amount of like letting go of yourself. So you can think of it as harm, but it's not necessarily harm. People use the term self-transcendence, and you could even think of that as you're renegotiating what the self is by making these micro sacrifices across time, whether it's through an interaction with someone that's characterized by love or towards something that you describe as meaningful. And I think encountering something that is meaningful perhaps necessitates a little bit of that self-transformation. But to transform, you got to sacrifice one aspect of yourself in favor of what's to come.
Okay, so especially because you guys have been talking about sacrifice, I've been thinking about this level of sort of sacred ideas that have a relation to this. And I'm reminded of apart from the Sermon on the Mount, which is one of like Jesus' famous speeches, where he's instructing people essentially to stop worrying about their internal material needs, basically because if you, according to him, align yourself with God, which I think in the context of this conversation is very much like aligning yourself with important higher ideals and then being less concerned about your own internal day-to-day sort of issues, that he says that like God will clothe and feed you if you actually seriously dedicate yourself to what you think is like the most valuable. And it makes me think again that of a lot of people who I know are very successful at game A, who are aligning themselves strongly with higher ideals and don't see their mission as being ultimately to sort of like ascend the hierarchy. So somebody like Elon Musk is a really good example, but there's tons more examples. So I guess something I'm wondering is, again, back on this idea where I really do think that people are underestimating, even there's the question at near the beginning where people are asking, well, do you need to be good at game A in order to succeed at game B? And I'm wondering, maybe we should ask, to what degree is game B actually like an extremely excellent sort of strategy for game A? And that if you're willing to sort of make that leap of faith and sacrifice in that way, what kind of a future does that yield?
Something that comes to me there is one of continued sacrifice.
I'm reminded of the trickery that can sometimes happen in words, which I suspect is probably quite intentional. As I'm thinking about the feeling that I have when I hear the word sacrifice, and then I reflect on its etymology, which simply means to make sacred. And that to sacrifice is the act of turning a particular activity into something that's participating in the sacred. And then I was noticing that I had an image in my mind, and I sort of spent a little time hunting it down and realized that it was a documentary I'd watched some time ago about a family that for 3 generations had been carving a particular piece of the cathedral in Barcelona, and about how there was a feeling of care. Like for 3 generations, each individual had given essentially the totality of their life to this particular practice. And then I remember the conversation that I had with Jubilee about the platform, the vision, the thing that she's holding. And I was just wondering what it would be like if a group of people had attached themselves to that particular project with that level of sacrifice.
I mean, that would be amazing. There's one who has that level of sacrifice at the moment. And it's funny, the word sacrifice doesn't appeal to me, except in the way that you just defined it, Jordan. Because I think of my evangelical Christian upbringing, it brings about, well, just a negative connotation. and what I've been in this moment. I mean, I came up with this idea 3 years ago, and I've had to do the interpersonal work after that to get to become the person that could possibly bring it into the world. And a big piece of it is not sacrificing, is my natural self is empathetic and wants to give my whole self up to the group. And I've had to learn to do the opposite, which has been so instrumental. Finding that in finding my own joy, what is easy for me and simple for me, because in a group, that same piece that's easy and simple for me is hard for somebody else, and vice versa. And I don't remember who was speaking, but someone was talking about utility, and I just reminded me of watching in Community these parents playing sports with their kids, and there was like dads playing whose kids weren't playing. I was like, oh, they're enjoying that process. And there was a piece of me that was, I hate playing sports, hate it with a passion, but I would do it for my kid. And yet I was like, it actually like shook my world, because I was like, oh, there's things that I hate that they actually really enjoy. And in Community, how that works, because my kid, if she wants to play sports, can play sports with them, and vice versa, where part of it is letting go of the sacrifice because somebody else that is not a sacrifice for, and instead finding your purpose and your utility and your flow, because when you find it, there isn't a sacrifice there, at least not have the negative connotation. The positive connotation of dedicating your life to something and finding what speaks to you and what brings you joy, I think is playing Game B. And enough people doing that in some kind of a organized way, which I have in my head, but any kind of organized way of like doing what is in your best interest, but having it be omni-win, and that is where Game A falls apart, is that a lot of what is utility and is, I get it and other people don't. And in Game B, I think it's, I get it so I can give it to everybody else. You get it so you can give it to everybody else. And the more we play in that, and the more we give ourselves those little slotted times to play in that, the easier it becomes, because I've experienced it. Like I experienced living mostly in Game B. I just had to come at it from a more selfish point, because it was, if that's making any sense. And I will stop talking now, because I could talk about this forever.
Jordan, when I dig up the etymology of sacrifice to make sacred, I immediately thought back to when you shared, what if every moment mattered? And that also connected me to what you shared, Peter, the pastor who communicated to you as if he was holding that sacredness. And in that interaction that he had with you, Peter, feels somewhat like what you were just describing, Jubilee. And he was in touch with something that he was able to give to Peter in a certain kind of way. And I'm sensing, connecting to this sense of a sacred idea when I like toss that around in my mind, the sense of there are many paths of change that are fueled by a deep hatred or distaste for things as they exist. And there are reasons to have distaste for the things as the way that they are. But I think that there is a need for coming up against the sanctity of life and finding yourself in the position where, independent of what's going on, you do recognize the privilege of being alive. And from that place, we're actually on solid ground from which to move. And I have to bring up, when I was hearing Tim speak some time ago, sharing the piece around the time scale, I had this image of like seeds falling in through cracks on a sidewalk, and then imagining that fast forward through time, trees growing out of that space, and then asking myself the question, what are seeds like that I can plant in myself world that might grow in that way? I don't have any good answers, but it felt beautiful to consider.
What keeps coming up for me is art. And there's this Philip Reese term called death works, which I really like. It's like works of art that are meant to undermine the sacred of society, right? So you can think of like stuff like piss art or piss Christ or, you know, Katy Perry or porn, things that remove the sacred, which remove community or communion. So if there's I wonder if there's an opposite of death works, like life works. And what comes first? Does the community come first and then the life works emerge from it? Or is it the other way around? Or is it kind of like a co-creating process? And if that's the case, what is the work of art that we want to co-create together is the question that's coming up.
Yeah, that's beautiful, Peter. It's so interesting. I wrote a very similar sentence yesterday to someone I know here who I just consider a thoroughbred wizard, and I don't know, but my sense involves more than just the modality of speech, although listening will always be present. So my aspiration is to open somehow this shared collaboration in a space where musicians, artists, drawers, you know, to resonate on that kind of scale and what can be created there. So I suppose a question from that might be, what other modalities of coming together might best afford this co-creation of art?
In a way, this feels like a piece of art, what we're doing right now.
One thing coming up for me, because both art and time have been mentioned, so filmmaking is something that I do, and the kind of deepest experiences I've had in filmmaking or in watching films kind of orient me in terms of what I feel like I'm looking for in this general space, because they are those experiences of kind of total presence and total engagement. And I think a lot of that has to do with how a film can orient you in time, where the film is a foregone conclusion. It's going to end however it's going to end, but your experience of it is moment by moment by moment by moment, very much in the present. And it occurred to me, I heard a conversation between Krishnamurti and David Bohm called "The Ending of Time," and Krishnamurti keeps making this point over and over again, that the conception of time that we have in the physical world, of there's now, and then there's the future, and then there's the past, and there can be transformations that happen over time. That doesn't work for psychological time. To create that distinction in one's own mind is the kind of seed from which all these different pathologies spring. And so, you know, there's something about these conversations that give us an orientation toward time that doesn't create that kind of fracturing. And I think art has that kind of potential as well.
That has me thinking of making art, and the experience of making art. Painting is where I started, and it was actually the experience of feeling like this didn't come from me, it came through me, that brought me to meditation. Like this is I didn't make that didn't come from me. Where in me did that come from? But that to be a vessel or a conduit through which life can flow and which art can flow is the goal. To be a good vessel or a good conduit through which life can flow. And what else was that? Did that have me think of? I'll come back to it. I'll leave it there for now.
Just wanted to say, because it brought forward in me that is not how I feel about art, because I'm not an artist, but it is how I feel about this thing that I'm creating. that it's coming through me. For some reason, it's me that it's coming through because of my life experience. And in experiencing that, it is not mine. It is ours, because it was brought on from all of my teachers and every experience I've had through everyone else. And I think that is game B. That is why we're able to have OmniWin, is like anything that's created was created with the whole, and therefore you can't own it in the same way that it's owned in game A. If I took all the risk and I did, it's like, even if I did take all the risk, even if I did all the work, you still didn't take all the risk and you still didn't do all the work. And so owning that and being in that of like this thing, and then being a servant of it, being like, okay, letting ego take the back seat and being like, okay, what can I do to move this forward? What is in the best within my capacity to be a better person today, to do something for the whole, to do something for this vision that I have, to do something. What is the best thing that I can do to move it forward, which is not necessarily what society looks at from game A and says, that is the next step. Make a business plan, do X, do Y, instead of like, no, what's my next step? What's the next thing to do? Because that's part of the spiritual practice.
Can you hear me? Okay. So we're reaching the point where it's time to start closing. And it seems like what might be nice is for everybody just to have a chance to reflect on how they've changed as a consequence of this conversation. And maybe to share if there's anything that is the question that they're leaving with, perhaps being moved through the course of the conversation. I can say for myself that in just the last little bit, the question that landed on me quite heavily, actually, this inquiry into the notion of a seed falling into the cracks of the sidewalk, and the difference between death works and life works. And what would it mean to play game B? Became in my mind this notion of what would it mean to be able to create life? What would it mean to be able to create a seed, a truly viable seed that would actually grow, even in the context of the sidewalk? And reflecting on the degree to which almost all of our efforts as humanity hitherto have in fact been death works. What would it mean for us to practice life works? So I will take that with me. If everyone else has anything they say, please. Now's the time when you pipe up.
On that point, the question I'm leaving with is, the daemon. When I rest into it, he's really creating art. He's not trying to win a finite game. So, I don't know if I have a question. It's just a statement or an insight that I'm leaving with. If we're choosing, I'll go with Phil.
It was interesting because I think the first thing that Jake said, and what we ended off at, was expression, and expressing what is true to yourself. All the collection of interests that you have, and showing that maybe as art. And I think I'm leaving trying to think through like, what is uniquely mine to share? As well, I think Jake also, as a second thing, prompted me to think about being versus having, and moving away from every single thing that I'm doing has to be because of some reason to get something else. And how can I switch a mindset so that I'm not hoping to get something in the future based on things in the present? I am going to pass it to Jordan.
I'm going to play volleyball and give a set shot down to Jorge.
Sure. So the one thing that I'm leaving with, I have the idea of slots and fitting things into slots and trying to capitalize on my own free time and try to reduce the amount of things that I give slots to in order to play this game B, where I feel like the initial thought in existing within game A is if we are living in slots, then you have to find a slot for B. But I think I can take that idea and surround myself in the idea of game B and let little slots of game A float around in that space, but just give that a small chance, right? And engulf myself in the other time. The question that I am leaving with is the notion of buffer, and I think that's the thing that's throwing me around more is what is this buffer? I saw it as trying to remove ideas from game A that might be messing with reaching the top of the hill where the city of game B is. I think that's what it is, but that's where my question is. And I'm going to pass it off to the other Jordan.
Thank you. Right. So I guess there's two things I'm sitting with right now. One is, and I think they're in some sense, possibly they're actually the same thing. But one of them is I feel much more, I feel like I'm identifying much more with pursuits of like a selfless nature than I was when I came into this conversation, which is really good. And the second thing is that in the vein of what some people have been talking about, sort of like Damon inspired things, I'm feeling much more a little bit ready to engage in things creatively with that sort of creative mindset and sort of drawing on intuition, which, well, we'll see how far we get with that. And if I have a question right now, one of them is, how do I keep that going? And which I'll have to think about for myself. And then the other would be, I'm a little concerned. I would like to avoid completely having like a loss of self, because I don't like complete non-egoism. I'm not into that. So, and I will pass it off to Jubilee.
Right, as per usual, I'm not going to know all of the ways that this conversation has changed me until long after the conversation. That is the power of a conversation, at least a good one. But the buffer is definitely something that is sticking with me. This idea of creating space in society and how we do that in our own lives by hopefully playing game B 90% of the time and game A 10% or whatever our life allows, but also on an individual sense of how many game B players does it take to buffer a game A player? Like, how many of us does there need to be to allow a game A player and like walk them through how to like play a more cooperative game once we've even figured it out? But like buffer, I'm sitting with the buffer, and I will pass it off to Isaiah.
Thank you. I feel this was a wonderful, beautiful conversation. I mean, I feel like sort of like an afterglow. I'm gonna probably have a hard time going to sleep. And I get any specific question that comes to mind is, how can I, and it's a personal question, so how can I find people, how can I find and help help other people who might be trapped in a game A mindset, shift it slightly and welcome them to game B? And how do I feel like that also engenders responsibility on me. So what is the nature of that responsibility for me? And I will pass it to Mike.
I find myself feeling just sort of struck with the the beauty of some of these exchanges. And I know on my end, there have been sort of sequences that have unfolded where, you know, a few people would say a few things and that sort of was a catalyst for something. And then I would say something and then that could serve as catalyst for other people. And I'm sure that's happened for others in this space. So it's just quite beautiful that we're able to do that, coming together, you know, most of us, I imagine, not having known each other. So that reflection feels present to me. And I have this, this sense of, or this question that's worth exploring. It feels abstract, but what's the difference between like pushing away from something versus digging in myself? If I'm up against something that I see as worth changing, and you know, can scale that out, pushing off of where I am versus digging in more deeply, and what does the place of deeper embrace take me? Do I begin to see things that I'm not able to see as I'm pushing away from it, and sort of birthing notion. So I will pass it along to Chad.
Great. Yeah, there was so much there. It's hard for me to pick one thing, but one thing that did come up, this is another of the convergent streams I think that's bringing me here. One of the last things I was researching was climate art, actually. So the environmental arts, and seeing it come up here again is very interesting. So it's making me rethink what I was doing in that project, maybe what the project had to say, and also how I was orienting myself in it, and what it might tell me about the artistic process that's going on right here, right now. How about Antoine?
I was really affected by one of Julie's comments on love. I find that, and it's also leads into my question, I find that I sometimes look at people I interact with people with kind of an awareness that I may not be able to do anything for them. Maybe they're just beyond whatever I'm capable of. But but now I'm thinking about, like, how can I go about getting or helping people get what I can't give them. That's now something that's now that's in my head now, instead of abandoning someone, sending them in a maybe more proper direction or something. So Jake would be my pick.
Yeah, thanks. I think the thread that's most alive in me right now is just this question around ego and what the role of ego is in all of this. And it occurred to me, just kind of like feeling my own sensations in this conversation and afterward, that there's a sense that from the kind of game A perspective, the prospect of sacrifice or like giving up something of yourself is very aversive, and it's from the standpoint of kind of being a self trying to get things. That idea seems like a threat, but from the standpoint of being engaged in a process, in a conversation like this one, where my ideas are only or not even mine, they're just part of the process that is this kind of ongoing conversation. It's not that my self is fully kind of effaced and destroyed. It's that the question doesn't even come up of, you know, what's the threat to me, or what are the implications for me? And just having the experience of that kind of orients me and points me toward, okay, maybe this is what interactions would be like. a different kind of system, in a kind of game B world, is the question of, you know, what am I going to get out of this? It's not that you get nothing or you give up something. It's that it doesn't have to come up. So that's what I'm leaving with. And I will pass it to Amy.
I'm also thinking about interactions in terms of, I'm thinking of life works, and maybe the first life work is cave paintings, and what were those interactions like in a torchlit cave, and are we having something like that right now, just being in front of our screens but still together? So that was just something that's kind of trying to make sense of what's happening right now, I guess. And I'm leaving with the idea that I want more of this. And I will go to Brent.
Hi. I guess I'm taking away this idea that I shared with Jubilee, who wanted to, you know, find the litmus test for what the differences between game A and B is. And she also said that she was unsuccessful at game A. I can really relate to that. And I got a bit distracted during the call, so I didn't participate as much as I wanted to, but I feel some solidarity with the group, and that some progress has been made, and I feel that net positive. I do want to leave the group with a point, something that didn't come up at all in this conversation, which is politics, because the presidential debates are actually tonight. It's already started. And in my view, in my humble opinion, there is one Game B candidate up there, just one. So I'm not going to tell you who that is. You can ask me if you really want to know or form your own opinion, but there's, you know, the personal quest in all this that we've been talking about, but there's also the sociological, political context and how our decisions work for other people too. So I think we need to give equal attention to that. Thanks. And I'll give it to, who hasn't gone? Zachary, have you gone? Go ahead.
Hey, thanks. No, that was great. I think it really expanded on some of the discussions from last week at U of T, kind of cornerstone discussions about what is Game B. And one of the, well, some of the themes that kind of threaded out there kind of show that Game B really is, humans are evolved for Game B already, and I think that we're kind of cultured for Game A. And I think looking, you know, looking across the entire spectrum, it's important to look at that. We saw words like love, the theme of community, that you really have to care moment to moment and live life with what matters. Like, these are essential things for what is Game B. I think anthropologically, when you look back at human beings and our predecessors, you know, a tribe would have gone through cycles of abundance and scarcity, which are still themes that we live with today, depending on how successful you are at Game A at different points in your life. And I think that, you know, we're already really primed, very much so for Game B, but maybe in the illusion of permanence of Game A, we kind of lose track and are almost exploited by what Game A is, to lose focus on our community. So I think that's, you know, cornerstone stuff, but looking to the bigger picture question, I suppose, that I have, I'm always in pursuit of answering, and perhaps, you know, in the nature of Game B would always be in the pursuit of refining the solution to it, is that the biggest obstacle to game B itself is game A, and game A is, you know, employed, well, rather successfully over the last, I don't know, 70 years or century, or perhaps 5 centuries by English-speaking Westerners, Europeans, but now it's played by everyone across, you know, game A is the great battle of civilizations. So I'm really interested in seeing how technology is employed actively and passively to kind of progenate and reawaken the meaning behind game B, and maybe see what technologies emerge to accelerate game B and outcompete game A at what it is, and kind of solve a lot of the predicaments that that exponential game A has left us with to answer for. So this talk was great. I wasn't keeping track of who was going there. Is there anyone who hasn't spoken yet? Perhaps Daniel?
Zach, I really liked how you laid that all out. In fact, I found it very hopeful. So I just wanted to comment on that. I apologize for the CD lighting. It's just my digital sunset. I think what I'm taking away from this is that at some point in this conversation, I felt almost like a raise in heart rate. And I realized it had to do with this feeling, which I don't even know if I'm qualified to say, that anything in my life up to this point that could be described as spiritual has been pointing roughly in similar directions. Like there's been themes towards my experiences, you know, growing up as a committed Christian and then losing that, and then my experiences through meditation practices and through, you know, those really meaningful conversations with people till 5 a.m, or my experiences with psychedelics and these types of interactions. It's like it's all pointing towards something, and it's almost similar to this idea that your psyche always has a task for you, and our relationship with that task is almost like a function of our level of courage, or our level of virtue. And maybe that's the source of the raised heart rate. Like I feel, and maybe this is my question, that something is being requested of me, that there's some sort of, maybe the question could be formulated as, what is it that I ought to sacrifice, or what is it that I am not willing to let go of in service of game B, or you know, some other formulation of whatever is in that direction. And it's very exciting, but it's also it's a little bit fear-inducing. And actually, just one thing to make it like a little more concrete and personal and less abstract. I think part of my fear here is that by being a game B player in a game A world, I think part of me is afraid that I will be taken advantage of. And I'm not entirely sure how to manage that, other than what Jordan said, one of the Jordans, this concept of a leap of faith. And so maybe that is something for me to run with. And I will, I guess, Melissa.
Hi. Well, I, for one, am totally unsatisfied. I think we're just scratching the surface, and I think it speaks to the benefit and essential nature of building a shared context and continuing to have conversations with people that have a shared understanding of the words that we're saying. And so here's to more of these, for one thing. I just wanted to say one thing about what Zachary said. It was very hopeful, but I think that the idea that game A is the enemy of game B, and it's the thing that most prevents it, or whatever it was that you said, that may be the case, but it also may be that it's the caterpillar and game B is the butterfly, that it is only because of that game B is possible. And I don't know if that matters, but it helps. That kind of perspective helps me not to go around hating everything. And so where I'm left, the question I'm left with is the question that I always seem to be asking, which is what does life want from me, and what is game B calling me forth to be and do? And yeah, I'm gonna keep asking that. That's all. Thanks.
Has everyone had a chance to speak?
I think I may be the last one.
All right, Tim, take us home.
Well, on taking us home, we couldn't find it unless we knew what it was. So what keeps coming, things keep coming back to me. Something actually, Jordan, you said to me when I asked you, I don't know if I asked you what your priorities were or what you were looking to achieve or something like that. And you said to develop or maintain or pursue a relationship with continuity. And this is a very powerful notion, that relationship, the difference between continuity and symmetry. And for those who might be interested by that, I recommend listening to Daniel Schmachtenberger talk to Forrest Landry on the Neurohacker podcast. But what's so important about it is that there is a am I leaving with a question? I think what is that which enables me to continue to keep going at all is, in some sense, not in some, is a deep knowing that I am and we are it. We are that which is continuous. We have, in our capacity to be in continuity, we are it. And so the notions of life works and death works, these are inherently related, and this notion of seeding is inherently related. You know, we are that which dies and lives, and so it's just a trust. And at that level, the religious language of faith in that which cannot be articulated is just a trust in the quality and the capacity for life itself. So I'm going to leave here and just keep on going. It's been lovely to share this time with you all.
Well, I think thanks to Peter for ultimately being the one who caused this to happen. Thanks to everyone for choosing to show up so fully. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Jordan.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. That was great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Nice to meet you all.
Thank you.